Good day, everyone. Welcome to Ready, Set, Go, a webinar series sponsored by HUD's Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs, known as SNAPS. My name is Joni Canada, and I work at home base, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. On behalf of SNAPS, I would like to thank you all for joining us. Today's webinar is Continuum of Care Program, Unified Funding Agencies. We'll be featuring the following presenters: April Mitchell and Juanita Perry, both SNAP specialists in the Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs and members of the Continuum of Care Program Regulation and Policy Team. Additionally, we have Brett Guino, Sherry Boyd, and Tiffany Moore on the line with us as our resource advisors to answer any content questions that you may have. Before we begin today's presentation, I would like to make some logistical announcements. Today's webinar will last approximately 45 minutes and is being recorded. The webinar recording and PowerPoint presentation will be posted next week on the OneCPD Resource Exchange Training and Events page at the web address shown on your screen. The Find By box can be used to filter the hundreds of training materials available. A brief feedback survey on this webinar will be emailed directly to the email with which you registered for today's webinar. Participants are strongly encouraged to respond to the evaluation to inform the delivery of future webinars. Because of the large size of the audience, all attendees will remain on mute for the duration of the webcast. You may submit questions to the CoC program resource advisors using the Q&A pod that will appear shortly on the left of your screen. We recommend using your phone rather than your computer speakers to hear the audio for today's presentation. Due to the large number of attendees, there may be a slight delay in the advancement of the slides. If you experience any other technical difficulties, please request assistance by using the Q&A pod that will show up on the left-hand side of your screen. All of your questions are important to us. However, we will not have time to answer all of them. If we do not get to your question, please submit it to the OneCPD Ask a Question at the web address on your screen. Please remember to reference this presentation, CoC Program Unified Funding Agencies, in your question. As a reminder, you will remain muted throughout the call, but can submit any questions that you have via the Q&A pod on the left of your screen. For additional information after the webinar, you can also reference the link in the Web Links pod appearing shortly at the bottom of your screen. Upon completion of this webinar, participants will be able to define a Unified Funding Agency, UFA, understand the designation process for UFAs, understand the roles and responsibilities of a UFA, and finally, understand the eligible UFA costs. Now I'd like to turn it over to April to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Joni. I know everybody is well excited for us to talk about this topic of the UFA. It's long awaited, so let's get started. So first we want to talk about what is a UFA. A UFA is the Unified Funding Agency, or UFA. It is a collaborative applicant selected by the CoC to apply to HUD for a single CoC program grant or for the entire geographic area served by the CoC. After a CoC elects to designate the collaborative applicant as a UFA, it must be approved by HUD before it can apply for funds with that designation. The criteria that HUD will use to determine whether to approve a CoC's designation of a collaborative applicant to UFA can be found at 24 CFR Subpart B 578.11 parentheses B of the CoC Program Interim Rule. To qualify as an eligible applicant, potential UFA funding agencies must be a legal entity, be either a nonprofit organization, a public housing agency, state or local government, or instrumentality of local government, be selected by a CoC, have the capacity to carry out duties of the collaborative applicant, have the capacity to carry out the duties delegated to a UFA listed in 24 CFR Subpart B 578.11 of the CoC Program Interim Rule. When HUD publishes the additional materials for the UFA, you'll be able to refer to Section 3 of the UFA User Guide. Not only is the CoC responsible for selecting the eligible entity to be the UFA, but also for ensuring the proposed UFA meets the eligible criteria. Next slide. We are often asked, what is the difference between a UFA and a collaborative applicant? The answer is, the UFA is a collaborative applicant that has also been designated to be a UFA. The same entity that has been designated to be the UFA and must carry out those duties is also responsible for those duties of a collaborative applicant, including applying for the CoC planning grant and submitting the consolidated application on behalf of the CoC. The next two slides will demonstrate the differences between the grant agreement process in a CoC without a UFA and a CoC with a UFA. Next slide. Here is a look at how the grant agreement process works in a CoC without the UFA designation. In this situation, the collaborative applicant's role is limited primarily to be preparing and submitting the annual CoC program consolidated application for the CoC. HUD executes CoC program grant agreements directly with each project recipient, as shown in this model. HUD has a relationship with each of the project recipients and the collaborative applicant if it is also a recipient of the CoC planning funds or other CoC planning grants. Therefore, HUD is the responsible entity for monitoring each recipient, including the collaborative applicant that receives CoC planning cost. In both slides 9 and 10, the collaborative applicant must be an eligible applicant in the CoC program and is the only applicant eligible to apply for CoC planning funds on behalf of the CoC. Since a UFA carries out the responsibilities of a collaborative applicant, as well as the additional duties associated with administering and subgranting or procuring the CoC program funds, a UFA is eligible to apply for funds in addition to the CoC planning funds to offset the cost associated with fulfilling UFA responsibilities. However, these funds are subject to the availability and are not guaranteed. Next slide. In this example, it shows the grant agreement process in a CoC with a UFA. If the UFA is awarded CoC program funds, HUD executes a grant agreement with the UFA, which then must execute subrecipient grant agreements or procurement contracts with the organizations that were selected by the CoC to operate projects as part of the annual application. In this situation, HUD only has the legal relationship with the UFA. Therefore, HUD is responsible to monitor the UFA, and the UFA role is to monitor the subrecipient. In both scenarios, the collaborative applicant must be an eligible applicant in the CoC program and is the only applicant eligible to apply for CoC planning funds on behalf of the CoC. Since a UFA carries out the responsibilities of a collaborative applicant, as well as the additional duties associated with administrating and subgrading or procuring the CoC program funds, a UFA is also eligible to apply for UFA funds in order to offset the cost associated with fulfilling UFA responsibilities. Like all funds, however, they are subject to the availability and they are not guaranteed. Right now, we'll turn to Joni, who has a poll question for our audience.
Thank you. To the left of the presentation, we have a poll question, our first, and I'll read the question and the answer, and I'd like everyone to take a second to select an answer. True or false? When there is a HUD-designated UFA, HUD has grant agreements with organizations carrying out the projects. Okay, and it looks like mostly everyone has gotten the correct answer on this. The correct answer is false.
Great. Thank you, Joni. Great job, audience. So now we'll talk about, next slide, now we'll talk about the designation process. The COCs must designate the collaborative applicant to be a UFA. This is not a decision the collaborative applicant can make during the application process. The COC must have a transparent process for determining whether to designate the collaborative applicant as a UFA. Before designating the collaborative applicant as a UFA, the COC should review the criteria that HUD will use to determine whether or not to approve the COC's UFA designation. The COC must ensure that the collaborative applicant has the capacity to fulfill all duties for which it will be responsible for. Next slide. Each year, HUD requires COCs to register with HUD and seek approval to be eligible to apply for COC program funds through the annual Homeless Assistance Grants Competition. It is during this process that a COC will notify HUD of its intent to designate its collaborative applicant as a UFA. HUD will review the registration materials and will consider certain criteria to determine whether or not to approve a COC's UFA designation. These criteria include the COC meets the requirements of 24 CFR, Subpart B, 578.7. The collaborative applicant is able to demonstrate that it has the financial management systems that meet the standards in Part 84, Uniform Administrative Requirements for Grants and Cooperative Agreements with Institutions of Higher Education, hospitals, and other nonprofit organizations, and in Part 85, Administrative Requirements for Grants and Cooperative Agreements to states, local, and federally recognized Indian tribal governments. Throughout this conversation, we will refer to those requirements as Parts 84 and 85. The collaborative applicant must also be able to demonstrate its ability to monitor subrecipients. Any other criteria is established by HUD per the NOFA that we publish annually. If HUD approves the designation of a UFA status one year, it does not carry over to the next year. The collaborative applicant must apply annually for the HUD designation as a UFA. Next slide. In the FY 2012 CoC program competition, the number one reason that the collaborative applicants were denied UFA status by HUD was because the CoC did not meet the requirements in 24 CFR Subpart B 578.7. This is not at all surprising considering that the CoC program rule was released only a month prior to the registration opening. It would have been a lot of work to come into full compliance with this part in 30 days. In 24 CFR Subpart B 578.7, it outlines the responsibilities of the CoC, which include operation of the CoC, designation and operation of HMIS, and planning for the CoC. In order for a UFA designation to be approved, all of these requirements must have been met. These are questions that a CoC needs to address within its CoC membership. A CoC should ask, does the CoC have a fair and open process that is welcome to new members and meets regularly? Does the CoC appoint additional committees, subcommittees, and work groups? Is there a written governance charter that is updated annually that was developed with the collaborative applicant and HMIS lead that outlines all of the policies and procedures needed to comply with the CoC program interim rule and HMIS requirements. The governance charter is applicable to all collaborative applicants, whether UFA or under the CA. Another question is, does the CoC have the performance targets and a process for evaluating the performance and outcomes of ESG in the CoC program? And has the CoC, in consultation with the ESG recipients, established a centralized or coordinated assessment system? The CoC is also responsible for designation and operation of HMIS, which includes designation of the HMIS lead, approving plans for privacy, security, and data quality, ensuring participation of recipients and subrecipients in the HMIS, and ensuring the HMIS is administered in compliance with rules prescribed by HUD. Lastly, the CoC must develop a plan that includes coordinating the implementation of a comprehensive housing and service system, planning for and conducting point-in-time counts of homeless persons, conducting an annual gaps analysis of the homeless needs and services, provide information to complete the applicable consolidated plans, and consulting with the ESG recipients. Next slide. HUD will also consider whether the collaborative applicant has financial management systems in place that meets the standards in Parts 84 and Part 85. Most of the collaborative applicants that applied for UFA status in 2012 met this criteria. Both Part 84 and Part 85 require recipients of funding to have all the financial management systems in place that will relate financial data to performance data and develop unit cost information where practicable. Part 84 applies to the states and/or units of local government. Part 85, again, applies to nonprofit organizations. Next slide. During the registration process, the collaborative applicant must demonstrate an ability to monitor subrecipients. The UFA is expected to monitor its subrecipients to ensure compliance with program requirements. If a UFA identifies a subrecipient that is not abiding by the program requirements, then the recipient must take one of the actions as outlined in 24 CFR, Subpart G, 578.107. Sanctions against the subrecipient. This includes actions such as suspending disbursements of funds or requiring the subrecipient to submit and comply with proposals to mitigate and prevent future noncompliance with program requirements. Finally, the regulation indicates that UFAs will be reviewed for other criteria set forth in the NOFA. In FY 2012, there were not any additional criteria. However, there may be in future years, and the collaborative applicant seeking UFA designation on behalf of their CoC should read the NOFA carefully to ensure they have met all the additional criteria. At this point, we'll turn the conversation back to Joni, who will allow our audience to answer a poll question.
Thank you. If everyone can look to the left of their screen again, we have our second poll question. What are the HUD selection criteria for UFA designation? A, the CoC must meet the requirements at 24 CFR 578.7. B, collaborative applicants, or CAs, must have all financial management systems that meet the standards in Part 84 or Part 85. C, CAs must demonstrate the ability to monitor subrecipients. D, other criteria as established by the NOFA annually. E, all of the above. Please take a moment to answer the question at the left of your screen. And it looks like everyone has mostly gotten this correct as well. Thank you. E, all of the above.
Great job. Thank you, participants. Next slide. Once UFA is designated by HUD during the CoC registration process, it will immediately be responsible for the following duties. Apply to HUD for funding for all the projects within the CoC's geographic area and enter into grant agreement with HUD for the entire geographic area. HUD will award one grant for any new funds and one grant for renewal funds, and any funding for CoC planning and UFA cost. However, a default on one grant will be considered as a default on the other. Other duties the UFA will immediately be responsible for is entering into a legally binding agreement with subrecipients and receive and distribute funds to subrecipients for all projects within the geographic area. In addition, UFAs will require subrecipients to establish physical controls and accounting procedures as per Parts 84 and 85 of the corresponding OMB circulars. Lastly, UFAs must be able to obtain approval of any proposed grant amendments by the Continuum of Care before submitting a request for an amendment to HUD. For the remainder of our PowerPoint presentation, Juanita Perry will present the rest.
Thank you, April. Now I will be discussing UFA relationship with subrecipients as it relates to the grant management process. As stated earlier in the webinar, upon HUD's delegation as a UFA, HUD only enters into a grant agreement with the UFA, and the UFA is awarded all of the funds for projects within the CoC. The UFA then enters into legally binding agreements with each of the subrecipients. The UFA must distribute funds to the subrecipients based on HUD-approved budget amounts for each project. The UFA must also share administrative funds with subrecipients. The amount of funding shared depends on whether the UFA is directly operating a project. UFA recipients that do not operate and carry out a project must share 100% of the awarded project administrative funds with any associated subrecipient. UFA recipients that also carry out and operate a project may use up to 10% of the grant amount associated with the UFA operated project on administrative costs. It must share all remaining project administration funds with its subrecipients. Lastly, the UFA will be responsible for ensuring that the subrecipients establish the necessary fiscal controls and fund account procedures in accordance with Parts 84 and 85, which we discussed in detail earlier in our presentation. Next slide. Now we will be discussing the UFA's relationship with subrecipients as it relates to monitoring and compliance. Upon delegation as a UFA by HUD, HUD will monitor the UFA to ensure compliance with the CoC program interim rule. This includes the annual monitoring of subrecipients. The UFA is expected to monitor its subrecipients to ensure compliance with program requirements. If a UFA identifies a subrecipient that is not abiding by the program requirements, then the recipient must take one of the actions outlined in 24 CFR 578.107 subpart G. Here are a few things that the UFA should take into account when developing a monitoring process to monitor its subrecipients. The UFA should establish a monitoring schedule or a timeline. Next, the UFA should create a startup conference with new and renewal project subrecipients. Develop a monitoring hand guide. You should reference the CPD monitoring handbook and review the CDBG exhibits. These forms can be located on the HUD website at www.hud.gov. You should also issue findings and concerns and provide feedback, which includes corrective actions. This does not necessarily have to be monetary sanctions. And lastly, you should review the APRs of your subrecipients. Before we get into the next slide, Joni will be conducting our last and final poll question.
Thank you. If everyone can take a peek at the final poll question at the left, and we'll go ahead and read it. Of the following, what are the responsibilities of the HUD-designated UFA? A, enter into a grant agreement with HUD for all funding within the CoC's geographic area. B, enter into legally binding agreements with subrecipients. C, conduct the CoC's point-in-time count. D, designate the CoC's HMIS. E, A and C. F, A and B. And if everyone can take a moment to answer the question. Great, and we've gotten it right again. F, the correct answer is F, A and B. Thank you.
Great, fantastic. Next slide. The last topic we want to touch on briefly is that UFAs are eligible to apply for and receive additional funding to carry out the additional responsibilities. If made available by HUD in an annual CoC program NOFA, and if prioritized by the CoC, a UFA may use up to 3% of the CoC's final pro rata need, or the maximum amount established by the CoC program NOFA. Eligible costs for UFAs are listed in 24 CFR 578.41 Subpart D of the CoC program interim rule. Eligible UFA costs include ensuring that all financial transactions carried out under the CoC program are conducted and records are maintained in accordance with general accepted accounting principles. Arranging for an annual survey, audit, or evaluation of the fiscal records of each project funded by a grant received through the CoC program. Monitoring all subrecipients and procured entities, and enforcing compliance with CoC program requirements. We have now come to the end of the UFA webinar presentation. Joni will now go over the webinar evaluation. Thank you.
Thanks very much to April and Juanita for today's presentation, and to Brett, Tiffany, and Sherry for answering questions. Thank you all for joining us for this webinar. You should now be able to define a unified funding agency, UFA, understand the designation process for UFAs, understand the roles and responsibilities of a UFA, and finally, to understand the eligible UFA costs. As a reminder, if you have additional questions, please submit them through the OneCPD Ask a Question page. This webinar recording and PowerPoint presentation will be posted shortly on the OneCPD Resource Exchange Training and Events page. Also, as a reminder, an email will be sent to all attendees following the training with instructions for how to get credit for this training and complete the feedback survey. You can obtain information or assistance from the OneCPD Resource Exchange by searching the resource library, checking out OneCPD News, using the Ask a Question function, or requesting technical assistance. Thanks again and enjoy the rest of your day.